London, 1817. Every soul in the ballroom watched as the Duke of Ravenshollow extended his black-gloved hand to the forgotten princess. Alexander Blackwood had never removed those leather barriers, not for handshakes, not for dancing, not even for the most desperate of marriage-minded mothers. Society whispered of curses, disease, madness beneath that elegant covering. Lady Cordelia Montague, at 28, had long accepted her role as the invisible royal daughter, overshadowed by prettier sisters and resigned to spinsterhood. Yet when their waltz began, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in 16 years, the untouchable Duke found himself wanting to bare his hands for someone. The crystal chandeliers of Carlton House cast their brilliant glow upon the assembled cream of London society, yet Alexander Blackwood, 5th Duke of Ravenshollow, stood apart from the glittering throng like a dark spectre at a wedding feast. His black evening clothes were cut to perfection, his cravat arranged with mathematical precision, but it was the sleek black leather gloves that drew every curious glance and whispered speculation. At 32, Alexander had perfected the art of existing within society while remaining utterly untouchable, a skill that had served him well in both business and personal affairs. The peace treaty with France had brought cause for celebration, but Alexander found little joy in the occasion as he observed the familiar dance of courtship and calculation unfolding before him. Mothers with eligible daughters circled like hawks, their predatory instincts sharpened by his vast fortune and ancient title, yet none dared approach too closely, repelled by the mysterious barrier of those ever-present gloves. Lord Pemberton, a red-faced gentleman with more enthusiasm than sense, had made the mistake of attempting to clasp Alexander's hand in greeting earlier that evening, only to find his gesture met with a slight bow and those impenetrable black leather fingers remaining firmly at Alexander's sides. The rumors that followed Alexander like shadows had grown more fantastical with each telling. Some whispered of hideous scars from a duel fought over a married woman in his reckless youth. Others suggested a rare disease that rendered his touch poisonous, while the most superstitious claimed his hands bore the mark of some dark compact made for his extraordinary success in trade and investment. The truth, Alexander knew, was both simpler and more complex than any of society's fevered imaginings, but he had long ago ceased caring what others believed about his peculiarities. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Lady Beatrice Ashworth, a determined matron with a daughter to settle, materialized beside him with the persistence of morning fog. Your Grace? She began, her voice pitched to carry just the right note of casual confidence. I was just telling my Vivian how distinguished you look this evening. Perhaps you might honor her with a dance? She is considered quite accomplished at the pianoforte and speaks 3 languages fluently. Alexander turned his cool grey gaze upon the woman, noting the calculating gleam in her eyes and the way she positioned herself to block his retreat toward the refreshment tables. Lady Ashworth, he replied, his voice carrying the particular blend of courtesy and dismissal he had perfected over the years. I fear I am a poor partner for dancing. My gloves, you understand, create certain difficulties with the more intimate figures. The excuse was worn smooth from use, but it served its purpose as Lady Ashworth's face fell into disappointed lines. She rallied quickly, as ambitious mothers always did. Surely a man of your obvious refinement could manage a simple country dance. The gloves need not signify. Indeed they do, Alexander said with finality. I find I am not suited to such close contact. Perhaps your daughter might find more compatible companionship among the younger gentlemen present. with a slight bow that managed to be both perfectly polite and utterly final. He stepped around the deflated woman and made his way toward the windows that overlooked the palace gardens. The cool night air that seeped through the glass offered some relief from the oppressive warmth of so many bodies pressed together, in elegant pursuit of their various agendas. Alexander had built his fortune precisely because he understood people's motivations with crystalline clarity. Where others saw romantic possibility or social connection, he saw transaction and calculation. His gloves had become both shield and symbol, protecting him from the grasping hands of society while marking him as fundamentally different, fundamentally apart. It was a lonely existence, but it was safe. And safety had been Alexander's primary concern for so many years that he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to desire anything else. From her position beside one of the palace's magnificent marble columns, Lady Cordelia Montague observed the Duke of Ravenshollow's latest encounter with the marriage-minded Lady Ashworth and felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for the man. At 28, Cordelia had become an expert in reading the subtle social currents that flowed through gatherings such as these, and she recognized in the Duke's rigid posture and careful positioning the same defensive strategies she herself employed to navigate the treacherous waters of court society. While her younger sisters, Princess Adelaide and Princess Beatrice, held court among eager suitors with the easy confidence that came from acknowledged beauty and the certainty of advantageous matches, Cordelia had learned to make herself useful rather than ornamental. Her morning had been spent reviewing the quarterly reports from the 3 charitable foundations she managed in her mother's name, ensuring that funds reached the intended recipients rather than disappearing into the pockets of corrupt administrators. The work gave her purpose and, more importantly, provided a socially acceptable reason for her continued unmarried state. After all, who could find fault with a princess so devoted to good works that she had sacrificed her own romantic prospects for the benefit of society's most vulnerable members? The fiction was thin, but it served its purpose, allowing both Cordelia and her family to maintain the pretense that her spinsterhood was a noble choice rather than an unfortunate circumstance. The truth was that Cordelia's quick mind and direct manner had proven far less appealing to potential suitors than her sister's more conventional charms. Men seemed to find her intelligence unsettling, and her tendency to speak plainly rather than in the flowery euphemisms favored by young ladies distinctly off-putting. She had learned to accept this reality with the same practical resignation she brought to all of life's disappointments, but acceptance did not make the isolation any less acute. Tonight, however, her attention was focused not on her own social inadequacies, but on a potential diplomatic disaster unfolding near the French delegation. The Comte de Beaumont, resplendent in his military decorations and clearly well into his cups, had cornered the wife of the Russian ambassador and was regaling her with what appeared to be an increasingly inappropriate story, judging by the woman's growing alarm and her husband's darkening expression from across the room. Cordelia recognized the signs of an international incident in the making and moved with quiet efficiency to intercept the situation before it could escalate beyond repair. "Excellence," she said, approaching the Comte with a warm smile that masked her urgency. "How delightful to see you again. I believe my mother was hoping to speak with you about the cultural exchange program she discussed with your ambassador last month. Would you be so kind as to accompany me to her presence chamber?" The Comte, momentarily confused by her sudden appearance, allowed himself to be smoothly extracted from his conversation with the Russian lady, who shot Cordelia a grateful look before hurrying away to rejoin her husband. As Cordelia guided the slightly swaying Frenchman toward a quiet antechamber where he could compose himself, she was unaware that her deft handling of the situation had been observed by a pair of sharp grey eyes that had found themselves unexpectedly intrigued by her calm competence and subtle grace under pressure. Alexander Blackwood had witnessed many social crises over the years, but he had rarely seen one resolved with such understated skill and genuine kindness. The forgotten princess, he reflected, possessed qualities that her more celebrated sisters notably lacked, and for the first time in years, Alexander found himself curious about another human being's inner thoughts and motivations. The realization was both unexpected and deeply unsettling, threatening as it did the careful equilibrium he had spent so many years constructing around his wounded heart. Queen Charlotte Montague had not built her reputation as one of England's most formidable monarchs by accepting defeat gracefully, and as she sat in her private study 3 days after the peace celebration, she found herself contemplating two of her most persistent failures with the strategic mind that had helped her navigate decades of court intrigue. Her middle daughter Cordelia possessed intelligence, compassion, and administrative skills that would make her invaluable to any sensible man, yet at 8 and 20 remained resolutely unmarried despite the Queen's increasingly desperate attempts at matchmaking. Meanwhile, Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, commanded vast wealth and influence while remaining as emotionally isolated as a hermit in the wilderness, his peculiar aversion to physical contact making him both fascinating and utterly unavailable to the ambitious mothers who circled him like vultures. The Queen had observed their brief interaction at the ball with the keen eye of a woman who had spent her life reading people's hidden motivations, and she had noted the way Alexander's attention lingered on Cordelia's graceful handling of the diplomatic crisis, as well as the momentary softening of his usually impassive expression when he watched her work. More intriguingly, she had noticed how Cordelia's eyes followed the Duke's solitary figure with what appeared to be sympathy, rather than the fear or disgust that his reputation typically inspired in others. It was, the Queen reflected, a most promising foundation upon which to build something more substantial. Her Majesty had not survived 4 decades of marriage to a periodically mad king without developing considerable skill in manipulation, and she recognized an opportunity when divine providence placed one so conveniently in her path. The summoning of the Duke of Ravenshollow to a private audience was accomplished with the same efficiency that characterized all of the Queen's machinations, and Alexander found himself standing before her desk on a grey November morning, his black gloves clasped behind his back as he waited for her to reveal the purpose of this unexpected command. "Your Grace," Queen Charlotte began, setting aside the correspondence she had been reviewing, "I find myself in need of your particular services." Alexander inclined his head politely, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "I am at your disposal, Your Majesty." The debts his father had accumulated through poor investments and worse judgment had been quietly assumed by the Crown during Alexander's minority, an act of royal generosity that had saved the Ravenshollow estates, but created an obligation that could be called upon when circumstances required. "I am experiencing some difficulties with my health," the Queen continued, her tone suggesting frailty that her sharp eyes completely contradicted, "and my physicians have advised a period of reduced social activity. Unfortunately, this creates a problem regarding my daughter Cordelia's public appearances. As you know, an unmarried princess cannot attend social functions without proper escort, and my usual arrangements have become inadequate to the task." Alexander felt the first stirring of unease as he recognized the direction of the Queen's thoughts. "You wish me to serve as escort to Princess Cordelia, Your Majesty?" "Precisely." The Queen's smile was both gracious and utterly implacable. "Your reputation for discretion and your natural disinclination toward romantic entanglement make you the ideal candidate for such a role. Cordelia requires a companion who can provide social credibility without creating expectations or complications. I believe you understand the delicate nature of such an arrangement." Alexander found himself caught between his desire to refuse and his awareness that refusal was not truly an option when the Queen of England made such a request. I am honored by your confidence, Your Majesty, though I fear my own social limitations might prove problematic. Nonsense, the Queen replied briskly. Your peculiarities are precisely why you are suitable for this task. Cordelia needs protection from fortune hunters and social climbers, not romantic pursuit. Your gloves, whatever their origin, serve as an excellent deterrent to inappropriate familiarity. Alexander recognized dismissal when he heard it, and bowed deeply. I shall endeavor to serve Princess Cordelia with the respect and discretion she deserves. Excellent. The Queen's satisfaction was evident in her tone. You will begin with Lady Ashworth's musicale tomorrow evening. I trust you will find Cordelia a most agreeable companion. After Alexander's departure, Queen Charlotte allowed herself a small smile of triumph. The Duke's reluctant acceptance had been precisely what she had expected, and his obvious discomfort with the arrangement suggested that his legendary emotional detachment might not be as absolute as he believed. Cordelia's interview, conducted later that same afternoon, proved equally satisfactory. The princess accepted her mother's explanation about declining health with the dutiful concern that had characterized her response to family obligations since childhood, though her quick intelligence clearly perceived that the Queen's illness was rather more convenient than genuine. Mama, Cordelia said carefully, are you quite certain that the Duke of Ravenshollow is the most appropriate choice for such a role? His reputation is rather formidable. That is precisely why he is perfect, the Queen replied. He will provide proper protection without creating gossip or false expectations. You need not concern yourself with entertaining romantic notions about the Duke, my dear. He has made it quite clear that marriage holds no appeal for him. The arrangement is purely practical, benefiting you both without emotional complications. The musicale at Lady Ashworth's London mansion provided their first test as an officially appointed pair, and both Alexander and Cordelia approached the evening with the wariness of soldiers entering battle formation. Alexander arrived at the palace precisely at 7 o'clock, his carriage gleaming with fresh polish and his evening attire impeccable in its sombre elegance. When Cordelia appeared in the entrance hall, he was struck by the understated sophistication of her appearance. Her gown of deep blue silk was cut in lines that flattered her tall figure, without attempting to compete with the more elaborate creations favored by younger women, and her dark hair was arranged in a style that emphasized the intelligence of her grey eyes rather than pursuing fashionable frivolity. Your Highness, he said, offering a formal bow. You look most elegant this evening. Thank you, Your Grace, Cordelia replied, accepting his offered arm with practiced grace. I appreciate your willingness to undertake this arrangement. I hope it will not prove too burdensome. On the contrary, Alexander found himself saying with surprising sincerity, I believe we shall suit each other admirably in this endeavor. Their arrival at the Ashworth residence created the expected stir among the assembled guests, and Alexander was grimly amused to note how Lady Ashworth's triumphant expression faltered when she realized that the Duke she had failed to capture for her daughter was now serving as escort to a princess whose advanced age and unmarried state had made her the subject of pitying whispers for several seasons. The evening's entertainment consisted of young ladies demonstrating their musical accomplishments with varying degrees of skill and enthusiasm, while their parents observed with the calculating attention of generals planning battlefield strategies. Alexander and Cordelia positioned themselves in seats that offered a clear view of the performers while remaining somewhat apart from the main body of observers, a location that allowed them to converse quietly without drawing undue attention to themselves. Your Grace, Cordelia murmured as Miss Ashworth launched into an ambitious but poorly executed sonata. I could not help but notice that our hosts appear to be experiencing some financial difficulties. The refreshments are notably modest for such an occasion, and several pieces of furniture that were present at their gathering last season have been replaced with less expensive alternatives. Alexander found himself impressed by her observation and the delicate way she had chosen to voice it. "You are very perceptive, Your Highness. I had noted the same indicators myself." Lady Ashworth's determination to secure advantageous matches for her daughters likely stems from more than mere social ambition. "Indeed," Cordelia agreed quietly. "It makes one understand the desperation that drives so much of what we observe in these gatherings. People make choices based on fear rather than genuine preference, which rarely leads to happiness for anyone involved." Alexander turned to study her profile, struck by the compassion in her voice and the absence of judgment that might have been expected from someone in her privileged position. It was a perspective that suggested both emotional maturity and genuine kindness, qualities he had rarely encountered among the members of society's upper circles. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Lord Edmund Fairfax, a young man whose handsome features and polished manners concealed a character of considerable shallowness and casual cruelty. "Your Highness," he said with an elaborate bow that managed to convey mockery rather than respect, "how refreshing to see you gracing such an intimate gathering. I confess myself surprised that you continue to attend these youthful entertainments. Surely someone of your, shall we say, maturity might find more suitable diversions among the matrons and dowagers." The insult was delivered with such smooth politeness that objecting to it would appear churlish, but Alexander felt an unexpected surge of protective anger on Cordelia's behalf. "Lord Fairfax," Alexander said, his voice carrying the particular chill that had made grown men reconsider their business dealings with him, "I find your observation both impertinent and inaccurate. Princess Cordelia's presence elevates any gathering fortunate enough to receive her attention. Perhaps you might benefit from observing her example of gracious behavior rather than demonstrating your own lack of breeding." The young man's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger, but he was not fool enough to pursue an argument with a duke whose displeasure could destroy his social standing with a few carefully placed words. He retreated with stammered apologies, leaving Cordelia to stare at Alexander with undisguised surprise. "That was most kind of you, Your Grace," she said softly, "though I fear you may have made an enemy unnecessarily on my account." Alexander felt an unfamiliar warmth at her gratitude, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Lord Fairfax's enmity is of no consequence to me," he replied. His rudeness, however, was unacceptable. As they continued to observe the musical performances and engage in quiet conversation, both Alexander and Cordelia found themselves settling into a comfortable rhythm of interaction that felt surprisingly natural despite the artificiality of their arrangement. He discovered that her intelligence extended far beyond the management of charitable foundations to encompass a sophisticated understanding of politics and economics that would have impressed his most valued business associates. She found that beneath his forbidding exterior lay a sharp wit and a capacity for observation that matched her own, as well as an unexpected willingness to listen to her opinions without the condescension that typically characterized men's responses to women's intellectual contributions. By the evening's end, both had begun to suspect that their partnership might prove more agreeable than either had initially anticipated, though neither was prepared to acknowledge the deeper implications of their growing mutual respect and the strange comfort they found in each other's company. The garden party at the Russian embassy took place under threatening November skies that seemed to mirror the political tensions simmering beneath the polished surface of diplomatic society, and Cordelia found herself grateful for Alexander's steady presence beside her as they navigated the complex web of international relationships that defined such gatherings. The ambassador's wife, Countess Volkonsky, had arranged the entertainment with typical Russian grandeur, transforming the embassy's winter gardens into an elaborate showcase of hothouse flowers and carefully positioned braziers that provided warmth against the autumn chill. Cordelia observed the assembled guests with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years studying the subtle dynamics of power and influence, noting how the various national delegations positioned themselves in carefully calculated proximity to one another, while maintaining the fiction of casual social interaction. Alexander moved through these currents with the same fluid grace he brought to all social situations, his responses perfectly calibrated to convey respect without subservience, interest without enthusiasm, and availability without invitation. Yet as the afternoon progressed, Cordelia began to notice something that she suspected had escaped the attention of their fellow guests. Whenever the conversation turned to topics that clearly made Alexander uncomfortable, particularly references to his unusual habits or questions about his personal life, his hands would flex almost imperceptibly within their leather confines, the gesture so subtle that only someone watching him with careful attention would have detected it. When the French cultural attaché made a pointed comment about the difficulty of conducting business with gentlemen who refused to shake hands in the customary manner, Cordelia observed the slight tensing of Alexander's fingers and the way he clasped his hands more tightly behind his back. Later, when Countess Volkonsky inquired with apparent innocence about his marital intentions, suggesting that a man of his position surely required an heir to secure his legacy, the flexing motion became more pronounced, accompanied by an almost invisible tightening around his eyes that spoke of carefully controlled distress. "Your Grace," Cordelia said quietly during a momentary lull in conversation, as they stood beside a magnificent display of forced narcissus that filled the air with unseasonable fragrance, "might I suggest we examine the ambassador's collection of rare orchids in the conservatory? I understand they have recently acquired specimens from the Indies that are quite remarkable." Alexander turned to her with an expression of surprise, mixed with gratitude, recognizing her offer as the diplomatic rescue it was intended to be. "I would be most interested to see such botanical treasures, Your Highness. Your knowledge of horticulture continues to impress me." As they made their way toward the glass structure that housed the embassy's prized plant collection, Cordelia found herself studying Alexander's profile with growing curiosity about the man behind the carefully constructed facade. The conservatory proved to be a haven of warm, humid air, perfumed with exotic blooms, and the relative privacy it offered seemed to ease some of the tension she had observed building in Alexander's posture throughout the afternoon. They walked in companionable silence among the carefully tended specimens, pausing occasionally to admire particularly striking examples of the gardener's art, until Cordelia found herself unable to contain her growing concern any longer. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I hope you will not think me impertinent, but I could not help noticing that certain topics of conversation this afternoon seemed to cause you considerable discomfort." Alexander's step faltered almost imperceptibly, and Cordelia observed the telltale flexing of his hands that had first drawn her attention to his distress. "I fear I do not understand your meaning, Your Highness. Perhaps you are not aware of it yourself," Cordelia continued gently. "But when you are troubled or anxious, your hands move in a particular way within your gloves. It is very slight, but once noticed, quite unmistakable. I wondered if you realized that your feelings are more transparent than you might wish them to be." Alexander stopped walking entirely, turning to face her with an expression that combined shock with something approaching alarm. "You have been watching my hands," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the obvious impact of her words. "I have been watching you," Cordelia replied with characteristic directness, "because I find myself genuinely concerned for your comfort and well-being. We are partners in this arrangement, Your Grace, and I believe partners should be attentive to each other's needs and feelings." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face as though trying to determine whether her observation represented a threat to his carefully maintained privacy or an unexpected offer of understanding. "No one has ever," he began, then stopped himself, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. No one has ever paid such close attention to my habits, Your Highness. Most people are too repelled or fascinated by the gloves themselves to notice anything so subtle as the movement beneath them. I am not most people, Cordelia said simply, and I suspect that beneath those gloves lies a story that has shaped your entire approach to the world. Would it be presumptuous of me to suggest that your aversion to physical contact stems from something more complex than mere personal preference? Alexander's laugh held no humor whatsoever. You are dangerously perceptive, Princess Cordelia. Perhaps too perceptive for your own good. He moved to stand beside a specimen of trailing jasmine, whose white flowers seemed to glow in the filtered light that passed through the conservatory's glass walls. My father was not a gentle man, he said finally, his voice so quiet that Cordelia had to step closer to hear him clearly. He believed that physical discipline was the most effective means of instruction, and he applied his educational theories with considerable enthusiasm throughout my childhood. I learned very early that human touch was associated with pain and humiliation, and even after his death, the lesson proved impossible to unlearn. The revelation struck Cordelia like a physical blow, not only for the casual way Alexander delivered it, but for the glimpse it provided into the formation of his carefully constructed defenses. I am so very sorry, she said softly. No child should ever learn to fear touch rather than find comfort in it. Yet your situation is not entirely dissimilar, is it? Alexander said, turning to study her face with the same careful attention she had been paying to his behavior. You speak of being watched and understood, but I suspect you have spent most of your life feeling quite invisible to those who should value you most. There is a particular quality to the way you position yourself at social gatherings, always where you can observe others without being observed yourself, always ready to respond to others' needs while your own go unnoticed. Cordelia felt her breath catch at the accuracy of his assessment and the gentle compassion with which he delivered it. How did you know? She asked, though the question emerged as barely more than a whisper. Because I recognize a fellow exile from the comfortable assumptions that govern most people's lives, Alexander replied. You and I have both learned to find safety in the margins, to make ourselves useful rather than vulnerable. The difference is that your isolation stems from being overlooked rather than feared, but the end result is remarkably similar. We have both become experts in reading others while revealing nothing of ourselves. The truth of his words resonated through Cordelia with painful clarity, and she found herself sharing thoughts she had never voiced to another living soul. When your sisters are acknowledged beauties who inspire poetry and passionate declarations of love, she said slowly, you learn to find your value in being helpful rather than desirable. I have spent so many years managing other people's crises and smoothing other people's paths that I sometimes wonder if I have any desires or dreams of my own left to discover. I suspect you have more dreams than you allow yourself to acknowledge, Alexander said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to wrap around her like a protective embrace. Just as I suspect that your intelligence and compassion are far more valuable than the superficial charms that society prizes in young women. Any man worthy of your regard would treasure those qualities above fleeting beauty. Their eyes met in a moment of perfect understanding, and Cordelia felt something shift between them, a recognition of kindred spirits who had found unexpected solace in each other's company. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying, promising as it did a connection deeper than either had anticipated when they entered into their practical arrangement. The charity auction for war orphans took place in the grand ballroom of Cordelia's own foundation, a cause so close to her heart that she had spent weeks personally organizing every detail of the event, to ensure its success. Alexander arrived early, as had become his habit during their weeks of partnership, and found himself genuinely impressed by the efficiency and thoughtfulness with which Cordelia had arranged the proceedings. The auction items, ranging from donated artwork to promises of social visits from prominent figures, were displayed with museum-quality care, and the guest list represented a careful balance of genuine philanthropists and social climbers whose competitive instincts could be harnessed for charitable purposes. Cordelia moved through the crowd with quiet authority, ensuring that every guest felt welcomed and informed about the Foundation's work while simultaneously managing the dozens of small crises that inevitably arose during such events. Alexander observed her progress with growing admiration for her skill in handling people and situations, noting how she could diffuse potential conflicts with a gentle word or strategic redirection while never appearing to exert any effort in the process. When the auction itself began, he positioned himself near the back of the room where he could observe both the proceedings and Cordelia's reactions as various lots were presented and bid upon. The amounts being raised were respectable, but hardly extraordinary, given the wealth of the assembled company, and Alexander found himself increasingly frustrated by the tepid response to items that represented genuine opportunities to improve the lives of children who had lost everything in the aftermath of war. When a particularly valuable piece of jewelry donated by a wealthy widow generated disappointing interest, Alexander quietly signaled to his banker, who was present in an unofficial capacity, and arranged for a series of anonymous bids that drove the final price to nearly 3 times the expected amount. He repeated this process throughout the evening, using various intermediaries to ensure that his involvement remained completely hidden while dramatically increasing the proceeds from the auction. Cordelia noticed the pattern, of course, because Alexander had learned that very little escaped her attention once her interest was engaged. And she cornered him in the Foundation's library after the last guests had departed and the final tallies had been completed. "Your Grace," she said, closing the door behind her with a firmness that suggested she would not be easily dismissed, "I believe we need to discuss your activities this evening." Alexander maintained his carefully neutral expression despite the obvious futility of attempting to deceive someone who had already demonstrated her ability to read his subtlest reactions. "I fear I do not understand your meaning, Your Highness." "The auction proceeded quite successfully, did it not?" "Indeed it did," Cordelia replied, moving to stand directly in front of him with the determination of someone who had learned to be direct when circumstances required it. So successfully, in fact, that several lots sold for prices that far exceeded their estimated value, often to anonymous bidders whose representatives seemed unusually well informed about the proper procedures for such transactions. Alexander felt the familiar flexing of his hands that Cordelia had identified as his tell when facing uncomfortable questions, and he realized that his ability to maintain privacy about his activities had been thoroughly compromised by her unwavering attention. "You are suggesting that I somehow influenced the bidding process," he said carefully. "I am stating quite directly that you personally funded nearly half the evening's proceeds while maintaining the fiction of public philanthropy," Cordelia replied, her grey eyes flashing with an emotion Alexander could not immediately identify. "What I cannot determine is whether you were motivated by genuine concern for the children we serve or by some other consideration entirely." The question struck Alexander as fundamentally unfair, given the careful thought he had devoted to ensuring that her foundation benefited from his wealth without creating obligations or complications for their relationship. "I fail to see why my motivations should matter, provided the results serve your charitable purposes," he said, allowing some of his own frustration to color his voice. "Your motivations matter to me," Cordelia said, stepping closer to him with a boldness that seemed to surprise them both. because they determine whether your actions represent genuine partnership or merely another form of obligation, discharge. I have spent my entire life being managed and protected and provided for by people who never bothered to ask what I might actually want or need, and I will not accept the same treatment from you, regardless of how generous your intentions might be." The passionate intensity of her words struck Alexander like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the possibility that his efforts to help her might be perceived as yet another form of the condescension she had clearly learned to resent. "I never intended to manage or protect you," he said, his own voice rising slightly as emotions he had spent years suppressing threatened to break through his carefully maintained control. "I intended to support work that I believe serves a vital purpose and to honor a partnership that has come to mean more to me than I ever expected it would." "You have come to mean more to me than I ever expected," Cordelia said, the admission emerging with a vulnerability that seemed to shock them both. "And that is precisely why I cannot allow you to treat our connection as another charitable obligation to be discharged through strategic generosity." Alexander found himself moving toward her without conscious decision, drawn by the honesty in her eyes and the courage she had shown in confronting him so directly. The distance between them closed until he could see the rapid flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat and smell the faint lavender scent that seemed to cling to her hair. His hands rose almost of their own volition, his fingers nearly reaching her face before the lifetime habit of self-protection reasserted itself, and he snatched them back, as though he had been burned. The moment stretched between them like a bridge neither quite dared to cross, pregnant with possibilities that terrified and attracted them in equal measure, before Alexander stepped away with visible effort, and Cordelia let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for far too long. The implications of what had almost happened hung in the air between them, changing everything while resolving nothing, and both realized that their careful arrangement had become something far more complex and dangerous than either had bargained for when they agreed to the Queen's convenient fiction. The carriage accident occurred on a rain-slicked street near Grosvenor Square when their driver attempted to avoid a runaway cart and instead collided with a lamp-post, sending both Alexander and Cordelia tumbling across the leather seats as their conveyance lurched to a violent stop. The November afternoon had already been grey and dismal, with intermittent showers that had turned London's streets into treacherous rivers of mud and debris, and Cordelia had been grateful for the warmth and security of Alexander's well-appointed carriage as they returned from yet another social obligation that had tested both their patience and their ability to maintain the fiction of their practical partnership. The impact threw Cordelia against the door, which burst open under her weight and deposited her unceremoniously into the street, where she found herself sitting in a puddle of muddy water that immediately soaked through her pelisse and ruined her afternoon dress beyond any hope of salvation. Alexander's reaction was immediate and entirely instinctive, his concern for her welfare overriding the careful barriers he had constructed around himself over nearly 2 decades of rigid self-control. "Your Highness," he called, scrambling from the damaged carriage without regard for his own dignity or safety. "Are you injured? Let me help you." He reached toward her with both hands extended, his focus entirely concentrated on determining whether she had been hurt in the fall, and it was only when his right glove caught on a jagged piece of metal protruding from the carriage wheel and tore completely away that either of them realized what had happened. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they both stared at Alexander's exposed hand, and Cordelia felt her breath catch in her throat at the revelation that greeted her astonished gaze. His hand was completely, utterly, unremarkably normal. The skin was pale from years of concealment, but unmarked by scars, disease, or deformity of any kind. His fingers were long and elegant, with well-kept nails and the calluses of a man who occasionally engaged in physical work despite his elevated station. There was nothing whatsoever about his hand that justified the elaborate mythology that surrounded his refusal to allow human contact, nothing that explained the fearful whispers or the careful distance that others maintained in his presence. Alexander recoiled as though he had been struck by lightning, snatching his exposed hand back and cradling it against his chest, while his face went ashen with what appeared to be genuine terror. Cordelia struggled to her feet without assistance, her mind reeling from the implications of what she had seen and the obvious distress that the accidental revelation had caused him. "Your Grace," she said gently, extending her own hand toward him in a gesture of reassurance, "you need not fear. I will not betray your confidence or share what I have seen with anyone else. But surely you realize that there is nothing about your hand that requires such elaborate concealment." Alexander backed away from her as though she represented some mortal threat, his breathing rapid and shallow as he fumbled in his coat for the spare glove he always carried for precisely such emergencies. "You do not understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but charged with an intensity that made her own heart race with sympathetic distress. "You cannot understand what you have seen or what it means." The coachman, who had been examining the damage to his vehicle with the practiced eye of a man who had witnessed many such accidents, approached them with the news that the carriage was no longer fit for travel and that they would need to seek alternative transportation home. Alexander pulled on his replacement glove with hands that shook visibly, his entire demeanor that of a man who had suffered some profound violation of his most fundamental defenses. "We will walk," he said curtly, though the distance to Cordelia's residence was considerable and the weather thoroughly unsuitable for such an undertaking. "Your Grace," Cordelia said, reaching toward him again, only to have him flinch away from her approach, "please allow me to arrange for another carriage to be sent. You are clearly distressed, and I fear that my seeing your hand has somehow caused you pain that I never intended to inflict." "I am not distressed," Alexander replied, though the obvious falseness of the statement made it clear that his usual command of social dissembling had deserted him entirely. "I am merely concerned that we return you to the palace before your absence causes alarm." The walk that followed was conducted in almost complete silence, with Alexander maintaining a distance between them that spoke eloquently of his desire to escape her presence as quickly as possible, while Cordelia struggled to process the significance of what she had witnessed and the profound impact it had clearly had upon him. It was not until the following afternoon, when Alexander appeared for their scheduled visit to the British institution's new exhibition, that Cordelia found an opportunity to address the previous day's revelation with anything approaching the delicacy that the situation required. Alexander's demeanor was even more rigidly controlled than usual, his responses to her attempts at conversation politely distant, in a way that suggested he was reconsidering the entire foundation of their partnership. They moved through the galleries in strained silence, pausing before various paintings and sculptures without either of them truly seeing the artworks that surrounded them, until Cordelia could no longer bear the tension that had settled between them like a physical barrier. "Your Grace," she said finally, drawing him into a quieter corner of the exhibition space where they were unlikely to be overheard by other visitors, "I believe we must discuss what happened yesterday. I cannot allow this constraint to continue between us when I fear it stems from a misunderstanding of my reactions to what I observed." Alexander's jaw tightened visibly, and she could see the familiar flexing of his hands within their leather confines that indicated his acute discomfort with the direction of their conversation. "There is nothing to discuss, Your Highness. What you saw was an accident that should never have occurred and will not be repeated." "But that is precisely what I wish to address," Cordelia replied, her voice gentle but firm in its determination. "What I saw was evidence that your gloves are not concealing any physical abnormality or medical condition, which leads me to wonder what they are concealing and why you believe that concealment to be necessary." Alexander turned away from her, ostensibly to examine a landscape painting that depicted a stormy seascape, though his attention was clearly focused entirely on the conversation they were having, rather than the artistic merits of the work before them. "Some secrets are better left undisturbed, Princess Cordelia. Some burdens are meant to be carried alone." "I do not believe that," Cordelia said, moving to stand beside him so that she could see his profile as she spoke. "I believe that secrets kept in isolation grow larger and more frightening than they need to be, and that sharing them with someone who cares for your welfare can diminish their power to cause pain." Alexander's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. "You speak of caring for my welfare as though our acquaintance were based on genuine affection rather than royal convenience and mutual necessity. I fear you mistake the nature of our arrangement, Your Highness." The accusation stung precisely because it forced Cordelia to confront the truth about her own feelings that had grown far beyond what their practical partnership should have encompassed. "Perhaps I do mistake the nature of our arrangement," she replied quietly. "But I do not mistake the nature of my own concerns for your happiness and peace of mind. Whether you choose to acknowledge it or not, I have come to care very deeply about your welfare, and seeing you tormented by something that appears to have no rational basis causes me genuine distress." Alexander turned to face her fully, his grey eyes searching her face as though trying to determine whether her words represented a trap or a genuine offer of understanding. "My father died when I was 12 years old," he said finally, his voice so quiet that she had to lean closer to hear him clearly. "He died during one of his rages while he was beating me for some minor infraction that had aroused his displeasure. One moment he was striking me with his walking stick, and the next he was collapsed on the floor, his heart having failed him in the midst of his fury. The physicians said it was a weakness of the heart that had been building for years, but I knew better. I knew that something in my touch, some curse or contamination that I carried within me, had killed him as surely as if I had struck the fatal blow myself." The revelation struck Cordelia with the force of physical impact, not only for the terrible burden that Alexander had been carrying for so many years, but for the twisted logic that had convinced a grieving child that he was responsible for his father's death. "Your Grace," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears for the boy who had endured such trauma, and the man who had never learned to forgive himself for surviving it. "You cannot possibly believe that your touch was responsible for your father's death. You were a child, and children do not possess the power to kill grown men through some mystical contamination." Yet the evidence seemed overwhelming to a 12-year-old boy who had just watched his father die while laying hands upon him. Alexander replied with the weary resignation of someone who had examined this conclusion from every possible angle and found it inescapable. "I have spent the last 20 years ensuring that no one else would suffer the same fate, and I will not change that policy now, regardless of what rational arguments you might present to the contrary." The pain in his voice was so acute that Cordelia found herself fighting the urge to reach out to him physically, knowing that such a gesture would only increase his distress while failing to provide the comfort she desperately wished to offer. Instead, she chose her words with the care of someone diffusing a delicate, explosive device. "I understand why a child would reach such a conclusion when faced with such a traumatic experience," she said softly. "But I hope that the man you have become can recognize the difference between correlation and causation, between a terrible coincidence and actual responsibility for tragedy. Your father's death was not your fault, Your Grace, and your touch is not cursed or dangerous or contaminated in any way. You are simply a man who learned to fear his own capacity for connection because a cruel parent and a tragic circumstance convinced you that love and touch inevitably lead to destruction." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and fear in rapid succession before settling into the familiar mask of controlled neutrality that had protected him for so many years. "Even if what you say were true," he said finally, "even if my fears were entirely irrational, the habits of a lifetime cannot be changed by a single conversation, no matter how persuasive the arguments presented might be." "Perhaps not," Cordelia agreed, offering him a smile that held more warmth and understanding than he had experienced from another human being since his childhood. "But understanding the true source of those fears is often the first step toward overcoming them. And understanding that you are not alone in carrying such burdens can make them seem less impossible to bear." Queen Charlotte's summons arrived 3 days later, delivered by a royal messenger whose serious demeanor suggested that the interview to follow would be far more significant than their usual discussions about social schedules and charitable obligations. Cordelia found her mother in the private study that served as the Queen's refuge from the more public aspects of royal life, a room decorated with personal mementos and informal portraits that revealed the woman behind the crown in ways that the formal state chambers never could. Her Majesty was seated behind her writing desk, but the correspondence that usually commanded her attention had been pushed aside in favor of a leather-bound journal whose pages appeared to contain personal reflections rather than official business. "Cordelia," the Queen said without preamble, as soon as her daughter had taken a seat in the chair positioned across from the desk, "I believe the time has come for us to discuss your relationship with the Duke of Ravenshollow with complete honesty, rather than the diplomatic circumlocutions we have employed thus far." "Mamma," Cordelia began, but the Queen raised a hand to forestall whatever carefully neutral response her daughter had been preparing to offer. "I am not interested in hearing about the practical benefits of your arrangement or the social advantages it has provided to both parties involved," Queen Charlotte continued, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had learned to cut through elaborate facades during decades of dealing with courtiers and politicians. "I want to know how you feel about Alexander Blackwood as a man rather than as a convenient escort, and I want the truth rather than what you think I wish to hear." The directness of the question caught Cordelia entirely off guard, forcing her to confront emotions she had been trying desperately to avoid examining too closely. "I find myself caring for him far more than our arrangement should warrant," she admitted finally, the words emerging with the reluctance of someone confessing to a weakness she had hoped to keep hidden. "He is intelligent and kind, and far more wounded than his reputation suggests, and I believe I may have fallen in love with him despite every rational argument against such folly." The Queen's expression softened, with what appeared to be genuine relief rather than the disapproval that Cordelia had expected to encounter. "I had hoped that might be the case," she said gently, "because I have observed Alexander's behavior during your time together, and I believe his feelings toward you have undergone a similar transformation, whether he chooses to acknowledge that reality or not." The revelation that her matchmaking scheme had been transparent to her mother's experienced eye embarrassed Cordelia less than she might have anticipated, perhaps because the Queen's obvious satisfaction suggested approval rather than manipulation. "You deliberately arranged our partnership in hopes of creating exactly such an outcome," she said, though the accusation held more curiosity than anger. "I arranged your partnership because I believed you were both in need of companionship and understanding that neither seemed likely to find through conventional means," Queen Charlotte replied, with characteristic frankness. "The fact that such companionship might develop into something deeper was certainly a possibility I considered favorably, but I would never have pursued such a course if I did not genuinely believe that you were well suited to each other in fundamental ways. Your happiness has always been my primary concern, my dear, even when my methods of pursuing that happiness might seem underhanded to those less experienced in navigating the complexities of human nature." The Queen rose from behind her desk and moved to stand beside the window that overlooked the palace gardens, her gaze seemingly focused on the bare trees that spoke of winter's approaching dominance. "Alexander's father was once my dearest friend," she said quietly, her voice carrying a sadness that suggested old grief rather than recent loss. Edmund Blackwood was charming and intelligent, and possessed of the kind of natural warmth that drew people to him like moths to a flame. But madness runs in his family line, as it does in ours, and the pressures of his position and his own internal demons eventually consumed the man I had once cared for deeply. By the end, he was violent and unpredictable, a danger to himself and to everyone around him, particularly to his son, who bore the brunt of his father's declining mental state. The parallel between Alexander's family history and her own father's struggles with madness was not lost on Cordelia, and she began to understand both her mother's sympathy for Alexander's situation and the deeper currents that had influenced the Queen's decision to throw them together. "You believe that Alexander inherited his father's capacity for violence?" she said, though the statement emerged more as a question than a conclusion. "On the contrary," Queen Charlotte replied, turning back to face her daughter with eyes that held both sadness and determination. "I believe that Alexander inherited his father's capacity for love and warmth and connection, and that he has spent his entire adult life denying those qualities because he fears they might lead to the same destructive madness that claimed Edmund. The tragedy is not that he might become his father, but that he refuses to allow himself to experience the joy and fulfillment that his father knew before the madness took hold. Alexander has convinced himself that isolation is safety, but isolation is simply another form of madness, one that destroys the soul rather than the mind." The Queen moved closer to Cordelia, reaching out to take her daughter's hands in a gesture that conveyed both maternal affection and urgent concern. "You have the power to help him understand that love is not a curse, but a blessing, that connection with another human being is not something to be feared, but something to be treasured. But only if you are willing to fight for that connection, even when he retreats behind his carefully constructed barriers and tries to convince you that caring for him is a mistake." The weight of her mother's expectations settled around Cordelia like a mantle of responsibility, but she found herself accepting that burden with surprising willingness because it aligned so perfectly with her own desires and hopes. "I want to help him, Mama," she said softly. "I want to help him discover that he is worthy of love and capable of giving it in return. But I fear that his fears run so deep that my efforts alone may not be sufficient to overcome them." "Then you must find a way to show him that taking the risk of loving someone is worth whatever consequences might follow," the Queen replied, "because the alternative is a lifetime of loneliness for both of you, and neither of you deserves such a fate when happiness lies within your reach if you are brave enough to claim it." The whispered campaign against Alexander and Cordelia began with Lord Edmund Fairfax's carefully planted suggestions at his weekly gathering of young gentlemen who prided themselves on being arbiters of society's most intimate secrets, and like all the most effective rumors, it contained just enough plausible detail to make it seem credible while remaining vague enough to resist direct refutation. Fairfax had nursed his wounded pride since Alexander's public humiliation of him at Lady Ashworth's musicale, and he possessed both the cunning and the malice necessary to craft revenge that would strike at the Duke's most vulnerable point while simultaneously destroying the reputation of the princess who had witnessed his embarrassment. The story Fairfax told centered on Alexander's mysterious gloves and his refusal to allow physical contact with anyone, suggesting that beneath the leather lay evidence of some dreadful contagion that posed a danger to anyone foolish enough to risk exposure. He spoke of leprosy in hushed tones that implied intimate knowledge of the Duke's condition, describing how the disease slowly rotted away fingers and flesh while driving its victims to madness and eventual death. More damaging still were his insinuations about Princess Cordelia's willingness to associate so closely with such a man, suggestions that her advanced age and unmarried status had driven her to desperate measures that no rational woman would consider. The rumours spread through London society with the velocity that only the most scandalous gossip could achieve, carried from drawing room to drawing room by people who claimed to be shocked by what they were hearing, while simultaneously taking obvious pleasure in sharing such delicious intelligence with their friends and acquaintances. Within a week, the whispered speculation had evolved into accepted fact in the minds of those who found Alexander's eccentricities suspicious, and Cordelia's spinsterhood somehow threatening to their comfortable assumptions about women's proper roles and desires. The dinner party at Lord Chancellor Eldon's residence provided the perfect stage for society's cruelty to manifest in its most refined and vicious form, as the assembled guests included many of London's most influential figures alongside their wives and daughters who served as the unofficial guardians of social propriety and moral judgment. Alexander and Cordelia arrived together as they had for so many previous engagements, but both immediately sensed a shift in the atmosphere that surrounded them, a quality of expectant malice that spoke of wolves circling wounded prey. The usual polite greetings seemed forced and overly elaborate, as though their fellow guests were performing civility while secretly savouring the entertainment that the evening promised to provide. During the lengthy meal that preceded the evening's musical entertainment, conversation flowed around topics that seemed to skirt dangerously close to forbidden territory, with references to mysterious ailments and the tragic fates of those who failed to exercise proper caution in their social associations. Lady Pemberton, a woman whose reputation for cutting wit was matched only by her capacity for deliberate cruelty, made pointed observations about the importance of maintaining appropriate distances from individuals whose backgrounds might harbour unpleasant surprises. The Duke's gloves, she noted with false sympathy, must make dining rather challenging, particularly when handling delicate items that might require careful manipulation. One wonders how a gentleman manages such difficulties, and whether those around him might not find themselves inadvertently exposed to whatever necessitates such elaborate precautions. Alexander maintained his composure throughout these verbal assaults with the stoic endurance of someone who had learned early in life to absorb punishment without revealing the pain it caused. But Cordelia found herself growing increasingly angry at the casual cruelty of people she had known since childhood, and the obvious pleasure they derived from inflicting humiliation upon someone who had never harmed them in any way. The evening reached its climax when Lord Fairfax himself arrived fashionably late to join the company for the musical portion of the entertainment. His timing calculated to maximize the impact of his entrance and the opportunity it provided for him to demonstrate his power over the assembled guests through his obvious knowledge of their evening's true purpose. He greeted Alexander and Cordelia with exaggerated courtesy that made his hostility unmistakable, while providing him with plausible deniability should anyone later question his behavior. "Your Grace," he said with a bow that managed to convey mockery rather than respect, "how courageous of you to continue participating in such gatherings, despite the obvious challenges your condition must present. And Your Highness," he continued, turning to Cordelia with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever, "your dedication to charitable causes continues to inspire us all, though one hopes your compassion does not lead you into situations that might prove detrimental to your own welfare." The implicit threat in his words was clear to everyone present, as was his satisfaction in delivering it before an audience that included many of society's most influential gossips and opinion-makers. Alexander's response was a masterpiece of controlled fury wrapped in perfect politeness. "Lord Fairfax," he said, his voice carrying just enough ice to make several nearby conversations falter momentarily. "Your concern for my welfare and that of Princess Cordelia is touching, though entirely unnecessary. We are both quite capable of managing our own affairs without the benefit of your guidance." The verbal duel that followed was conducted with the refined savagery that characterized conflicts between gentlemen who understood that direct confrontation would be vulgar, while indirect warfare could be elevated to an art form. Fairfax made increasingly bold references to the dangers of association with individuals whose true nature remained hidden from public view, while Alexander responded with cutting observations about the character defects that drove certain people to find entertainment in spreading malicious gossip about their betters. The exchange might have continued indefinitely, each man probing for weaknesses while maintaining the facade of civilized discourse, but Cordelia's intervention brought it to an abrupt conclusion that shocked everyone present, including herself. "Lord Fairfax," she said, her voice cutting through the tension with the authority that came from her royal birth, and her obvious fury at what she had witnessed, "your behavior this evening has been beneath contempt, and your implications about the Duke of Ravenshollow's character are both false and cowardly. If you have specific accusations to make, then make them openly rather than hiding behind innuendo and suggestion like a schoolyard bully who lacks the courage to face his victims directly." The assembled guests fell silent in the face of such unprecedented directness from a member of the royal family, and Fairfax himself seemed momentarily stunned by her willingness to abandon the subtle protocols that usually governed such confrontations. "Your Highness," he stammered, clearly unprepared for such a direct assault on his campaign of whispered destruction, "I merely expressed concern for the welfare of all parties involved in what appears to be an unusual situation." "Then allow me to address your concerns directly," Cordelia replied, her grey eyes flashing with an anger that made several people take involuntary steps backward. "The Duke of Ravenshollow is a gentleman of impeccable character whose personal habits, whatever their origin, represent no danger whatsoever to myself or to anyone else present. Your attempts to suggest otherwise reveal more about your own character than about his, and I trust that this will be the end of such disgraceful speculation." The confrontation ended with Fairfax's strategic retreat to the far side of the room. But the damage had been done not only to his campaign against them, but to Alexander's carefully maintained emotional equilibrium. The public defense that Cordelia had mounted on his behalf, while magnificent in its courage and loyalty, had also forced him to confront the extent to which his association with her was exposing her to exactly the kind of malicious attack he had spent years avoiding for himself. Alexander's withdrawal from Cordelia's life was as swift and complete as a door slamming shut, executed with the same ruthless efficiency that he brought to all decisions that he deemed necessary for the protection of those he cared about most deeply. The morning after the disastrous dinner party, he sent a formal note to the palace requesting an immediate audience with Queen Charlotte, during which he announced his intention to terminate the escort arrangement that had brought him and Cordelia together. His explanation focused on the growing scrutiny that their partnership had attracted, and his concern that continued association with him would damage Cordelia's reputation and interfere with her important charitable work, arguments that were both rational and completely unconvincing to a woman who had spent decades reading the true motivations that lay beneath people's stated reasons for their actions. "Your Grace," the Queen said after listening to his carefully prepared speech with the patience of someone who understood that allowing him to finish would make the subsequent conversation more productive. "You speak of protecting my daughter's reputation and welfare, but I suspect your true motivation is protecting yourself from the vulnerability that genuine connection requires." Alexander maintained his composure despite the accuracy of her assessment, though the slight flexing of his hands within their leather confines betrayed his discomfort with her penetrating observation. "Your Majesty," he replied with formal courtesy, "I believe the recent events demonstrate quite clearly that my association with Princess Cordelia has become a liability that serves neither her interests nor my own. The scandal-mongering that has attached itself to our partnership threatens to undermine the important work she does with her charitable foundations, and I cannot, in good conscience, allow such damage to continue for the sake of my own selfish desires for companionship." The Queen's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine sympathy for his obvious distress, but her response carried the firmness of someone who had no intention of accepting his decision without a fight. "You speak of selfish desires as though caring for another person were somehow shameful," she said gently, "when in fact it represents the most moral aspect of human nature. Cordelia has found happiness in your company that she has never experienced with any other man, and throwing that away because of the malicious gossip spread by jealous fools seems to me the height of foolishness rather than noble sacrifice." The battle of wills that followed lasted for nearly an hour, with the Queen employing every argument and appeal she could devise to change Alexander's mind, while he remained inflexibly committed to his course of action, despite the obvious pain it was causing him. In the end, it was his genuine love for Cordelia, rather than any consideration for his own welfare, that made his position unassailable, because he truly believed that removing himself from her life represented the only way to protect her from the continued damage that their association was inflicting upon her reputation and prospects. The Queen finally accepted his decision with the grace of someone who recognized when further argument would be futile. But her parting words carried a warning that lingered in Alexander's mind long after he had left the palace. "You may believe that you are protecting Cordelia by withdrawing from her life," she said as he prepared to take his leave, "but you may discover that your absence creates more problems than your presence ever did. People who wish to damage someone's reputation rarely require factual justification for their attacks, and removing yourself from the equation may simply provide them with different ammunition to use against her." The truth of this prediction became evident within days of Alexander's disappearance from the social circuit, as the rumor mill that had focused on his mysterious gloves and supposed contagion quickly shifted to speculation about why such a devoted partnership had ended so abruptly. Some suggested that Cordelia had finally discovered the true nature of his condition and fled in horror from what she had learned, while others proposed that she had indeed been contaminated by their association and was now sequestered to prevent the spread of whatever disease she had contracted from him. The most vicious gossips whispered that she had been pregnant with his child and that the pregnancy had ended in tragedy, explaining both his sudden withdrawal and her own retreat from public view. Cordelia's world contracted dramatically in Alexander's absence, shrinking to encompass only the essential duties and obligations that could not be delegated to others, while everything that had given her life, pleasure, and meaning seemed to lose its savor overnight. Her work with the charitable foundations continued, but she found herself going through the motions of administration and oversight without the enthusiasm and energy that had previously characterized her approach to these responsibilities. The weekly meetings with foundation directors became exercises in endurance rather than collaborative planning sessions, and the personal visits to hospitals and orphanages that had once provided her with direct connection to the people her work served now felt like additional burdens rather than sources of satisfaction and purpose. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by dreams in which Alexander reached toward her with ungloved hands, only to disappear when she tried to respond to his gesture, and food lost all appeal as the simple act of dining reminded her of the countless meals they had shared in each other's company. Her sisters noticed her decline and made awkward attempts to provide comfort and distraction, but their efforts only served to highlight the gulf that had always existed between Cordelia's inner life and their more conventional concerns with fashion and romance and social triumph. The Queen observed her daughter's deterioration with the sharp eyes of a mother who understood that heartbreak could be as physically devastating as any disease, but her attempts to convince Cordelia to reach out to Alexander met with gentle but firm resistance from a woman who had inherited her mother's pride along with her intelligence and determination. Meanwhile, Alexander discovered that his strategic withdrawal had achieved exactly the opposite of what he had intended, as the gossip surrounding Cordelia's supposed contamination and disgrace grew more vicious and elaborate with each passing day. His self-imposed exile from society meant that he was powerless to defend her reputation or provide the kind of visible support that might have countered the malicious speculation, and his growing awareness of the damage his absence was causing filled him with a despair more acute than any he had experienced since his father's death. The protection he had sought to provide through separation had transformed into a different kind of destruction, one that threatened to consume the woman he loved while leaving him helpless to prevent the catastrophe his own actions had set in motion. The fire at St. Catherine's Home for Foundlings began in the early hours of a December evening when a candle left burning too close to old draperies ignited the threadbare fabric and spread with terrifying speed through the building's dry wooden corridors. Cordelia had been conducting her weekly visit to review the children's progress with their lessons and ensure that the winter provisions she had arranged were being distributed properly when the first wisps of smoke began curling beneath the door of the small office where she sat with the institution's harried director. The building, like so many charitable establishments, had been constructed decades earlier with more attention to economy than safety, and its narrow staircase and labyrinthine layout created a maze that became deadly when filled with choking smoke and panicked children. By the time Cordelia and Mrs. Hartwell, the director, realized the extent of the danger, flames had already blocked the main staircase and were spreading rapidly through the upper floors, where most of the children slept in dormitories that housed far too many small souls in far too little space. The sound that would haunt Cordelia's nightmares for months to come was not the roar of the fire itself, but the terrified cries of children calling for help from windows they could not reach and rooms they could not escape. Mrs. Hartwell, a practical woman who had devoted 20 years of her life to caring for London's abandoned children, immediately began organizing the evacuation of those youngsters who could be reached through the building's rear entrance, but it quickly became apparent that several children remained trapped on the upper floors with no clear path to safety. Cordelia did not hesitate before plunging back into the smoke-filled building despite Mrs. Hartwell's desperate protests, driven by the knowledge that every moment of delay meant another child might perish in the flames that were consuming what had been their only refuge from London's harsh streets. Alexander's arrival at the scene was the result of a restless evening walk that had taken him past the orphanage just as the first screams pierced the winter air and the glow of flames began painting the windows with hellish light. His initial thought was not of the children, or the building, or even the tragedy unfolding before him, but of Cordelia and the sick certainty that she would be inside trying to help, rather than standing safely in the street with the other observers who were beginning to gather. The crowd that had assembled included neighbors who had come to gawk at the spectacle, and a handful of men who were making ineffective attempts to organize some kind of rescue effort, but Alexander pushed through them all without ceremony or explanation, his attention focused entirely on the upper windows, where small faces appeared and disappeared through the smoke like ghosts pleading for salvation. When he learned from Mrs. Hartwell that Princess Cordelia had gone back inside to search for trapped children and had not been seen for several minutes, Alexander felt something fundamental shift inside him, a breaking of barriers that had held for so many years that their collapse felt like the earth moving beneath his feet. Without conscious thought, he began stripping off his gloves as he ran toward the burning building, his hands emerging into the cold night air for the first time in public since his childhood. The sensation of winter wind against his bare skin was shocking in its intensity. But the urgency of reaching Cordelia before the fire claimed her overrode every instinct that had governed his behavior for the past 16 years. He plunged into the building through a window that had been broken by the heat, using his exposed hands to feel his way through corridors filled with smoke so thick that visibility was reduced to mere inches. The scene that greeted Alexander when he finally located Cordelia on the second floor was one that would be etched into his memory with perfect clarity for the rest of his life. She was crouched in a small room beside a bed where 3 young children huddled together in terror, her dress scorched and her face streaked with soot as she tried to comfort them while searching desperately for some means of escape from their increasingly desperate situation. A fallen beam blocked the doorway, and flames were beginning to creep along the walls with hungry determination, creating a trap that seemed to offer no possibility of survival for any of them. Cordelia looked up as Alexander appeared through the smoke, and the relief and recognition in her eyes struck him with almost physical force, though he also saw her shock at the sight of his bare hands as he immediately set about moving the burning debris that stood between them and safety. "Your Grace!" she called out over the roar of the fire. "Your hands! You must not." But Alexander was already grasping the smoldering beam with his naked fingers, his flesh protected from serious burns only by the speed with which he worked and the adrenaline that made him impervious to the pain that should have stopped him immediately. The wood was heavy and awkwardly positioned, requiring him to use both hands in a coordinated effort that would have been impossible while wearing gloves, and as he heaved it aside with strength born of desperation, he could hear the gasps and exclamations from the crowd that had gathered in the street below, and could see them through the broken windows. There was no hiding what he was doing, no possibility of maintaining the fiction that had governed his public behavior for so many years. But in that moment, the only thing that mattered was creating a path that would allow Cordelia and the children to reach safety before the building's structure gave way entirely. The evacuation that followed required multiple trips through smoke-filled corridors and down staircases that groaned ominously under their feet, with Alexander carrying children who were too frightened or too overcome by smoke to walk, while Cordelia guided and encouraged the older ones, who could manage the journey with assistance. His bare hands were essential to the rescue effort, allowing him to grip securely the children he carried, and to move obstacles that would have been impossible to handle, while wearing leather gloves that reduced both dexterity and sensitivity. With each trip through the burning building, more observers gathered in the street to witness the extraordinary sight of the famously gloved Duke of Ravenshollow working with his hands completely exposed, revealing them to be entirely normal and unmarked by any of the diseases or deformities that rumor had suggested. By the time the last child had been brought to safety and the fire brigade had arrived to begin their largely futile efforts to save what remained of the building, Alexander's heroism, while bare-handed, had become the most witnessed and discussed event in London society's recent memory. The children he had saved clung to him without fear or revulsion, their small hands grasping his with the trust that only the very young can offer. To someone who has risked everything for their welfare, and their obvious comfort with his touch made any suggestion of contamination or danger seem not merely false but absurd to everyone who observed their interaction. In the aftermath of the fire, as the rescued children were taken to temporary shelter in the parish church, while arrangements were made for their longer-term care, Cordelia and Alexander found themselves working side by side to tend to minor injuries and provide comfort to youngsters who had lost everything they possessed in the flames. Alexander's hands remained bare as he helped wash soot from small faces and applied simple bandages to cuts and scrapes, his touch gentle and healing rather than harmful in any way that even the most superstitious observer could detect. The children responded to him with immediate acceptance, perhaps sensing the fundamental kindness that he had hidden behind his gloves for so many years, and watching him interact with them gave Cordelia a glimpse of the man he might have been if fear had not shaped his every interaction with the world around him. As they worked together in the flickering candlelight of the church, sharing the intimate labor of caring for those who needed their help most desperately, the barriers that had stood between them seemed to dissolve as completely as his gloves had been abandoned in the face of crisis. "Your Grace," Cordelia said softly as they knelt beside a young girl who had fallen asleep despite the chaos around her. "You cannot continue to believe that your touch is dangerous when you have spent this evening saving lives with those very hands. Look at these children and tell me that they seem harmed by your contact with them." Alexander's response came after a long moment of silence, during which he seemed to be wrestling with truths that had governed his entire adult life. "I know that what I see contradicts everything I have believed about myself for 16 years, he said finally, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "But beliefs that have shaped one's existence for so long are not easily abandoned, even when evidence suggests they were based on false premises from the beginning." "Then perhaps it is time to examine those premises more closely," Cordelia replied, reaching out to cover his bare hand with her own, in a gesture that made him flinch slightly before he forced himself to remain still. "Tell me exactly what happened the day your father died, not the version you have carried in your memory, but the facts as they actually occurred." Alexander's account, delivered in halting sentences as though each word caused him physical pain, revealed a truth far different from the story he had told himself for so many years. His father had not died while beating him for some minor transgression, but during a violent rage that had been triggered by Alexander's refusal to participate in the cruel punishment of a young servant who had accidentally broken a valuable vase. Edmund Blackwood had demanded that his 12-year-old son hold the servant down while he administered a beating that would have left the boy permanently injured, and when Alexander had refused and attempted to shield the servant with his own body, his father had flown into the apoplectic fury that had ultimately claimed his life. "Your father did not die because you touched him," Cordelia said gently when his painful recitation had concluded. "He died because his own rage consumed him when you chose compassion over cruelty, mercy over brutality. You did not kill him with your touch. You simply refused to become the kind of man he wanted you to be, and his inability to accept that choice destroyed him." The revelation struck Alexander with the force of physical impact, forcing him to confront the possibility that his entire understanding of that traumatic day had been shaped by the guilt and confusion of a child who had sought to make sense of tragedy by accepting blame for circumstances beyond his control. As he held the sleeping child in his arms and felt the complete absence of any harmful effect from his touch, Alexander began to understand that the curse he had carried for so long existed only in his own mind, a prison built from grief and maintained by fear that had robbed him of 16 years of normal human connection and nearly cost him the love of the only woman who had ever seen past his defenses to the wounded man beneath. The morning Alexander Blackwood appeared at White's Gentlemen's Club without his customary black gloves marked a watershed moment in London society that would be discussed and analysed in drawing rooms and coffee houses for decades to come. The famous establishment fell silent as he entered the main reading room with his hands bare and visible, his fingers uncovered for the first time since anyone present could remember, and the assembled gentlemen found themselves staring with the fascination typically reserved for exotic creatures displayed at traveling menageries. Alexander moved through the familiar space with the same confident bearing he had always possessed, but something fundamental had changed in his demeanor that went far beyond the simple absence of leather covering his hands. There was a lightness to his step, and a warmth in his expression that spoke of a man who had been released from some terrible burden, And when Lord Pemberton approached him with obvious curiosity about his dramatic transformation, Alexander's response carried none of the defensive tension that had characterized his interactions for so many years. "My lord," Alexander said with genuine warmth, extending his bare hand for the handshake that Pemberton had been denied so many times before, "I hope you will forgive my past discourtesy. I find myself in rather different circumstances these days." The sensation that Pemberton experienced when their hands finally met was nothing more remarkable than the normal pressure of flesh against flesh, warm and entirely human, completely devoid of any supernatural quality or dangerous contamination that might justify the elaborate mythology that had surrounded Alexander's aversion to physical contact. Word of the Duke's transformation spread through London's social circles with the velocity of wildfire, carried by witnesses who had been present at White's and embellished by others who claimed intimate knowledge of the circumstances that had precipitated such a dramatic change in behavior. The story of his heroism during the orphanage fire had already become legend, with details growing more spectacular with each telling. But his continued appearance in society with ungloved hands represented an ongoing spectacle that kept the gossips supplied with fresh material on a daily basis. Alexander's formal call upon Princess Cordelia 3 days later followed all the traditional protocols for a gentleman seeking to court a lady, complete with flowers, proper chaperonage, and a carefully prepared speech that left no doubt about his romantic intentions. He arrived at the palace precisely at the appointed hour, dressed in his finest morning attire, but with his hands conspicuously bare, carrying a bouquet of white roses that had been selected for a symbolic representation of new beginnings and pure devotion. The footman who admitted him to Cordelia's private sitting room showed no visible reaction to the Duke's uncovered hands, though Alexander suspected that news of his transformation had already reached every servant in the palace through the mysterious but efficient communication network that connected all of London's great houses. Cordelia received him with a composure that barely concealed her excitement at this formal acknowledgement of the feelings that had grown between them during their months of forced partnership, though she was careful to maintain the proper decorum that such an occasion demanded, despite her desire to throw herself into his arms and celebrate the courage he had shown in abandoning the protective barriers that had defined his existence for so long. "Your Grace," she said as he presented his bouquet with a bow that was both perfectly correct and unmistakably intimate, "how kind of you to call upon me this afternoon. I trust you are well recovered from your exertions during the recent fire." Alexander's response was carefully crafted to convey both his romantic intentions and his awareness of the formal requirements that governed such interactions between members of their respective ranks. "Your Highness," he said, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite the presence of her chaperone in the far corner of the room. "I am indeed well recovered, and I hope you will allow me to express my gratitude for the role you played in helping me discover truths about myself that I had been too frightened to acknowledge. I find myself hoping that our association might continue on rather different terms than those originally established by your gracious mother. The courtship that followed scandalized London society precisely because it represented such a departure from the careful calculations and strategic alliances that typically characterized matches between individuals of their elevated stations. Alexander pursued Cordelia with the passionate devotion of a man who had discovered love late in life and was determined not to waste a moment of the happiness that had been offered to him, while she responded with a warmth and openness that revealed depths of feeling she had never been permitted to express during her years of dutiful spinsterhood. Their public appearances together created a sensation wherever they went, not only because of Alexander's dramatic transformation, but because their obvious mutual affection challenged the cynical assumptions that governed most aristocratic relationships in their social circle. When they attended the opera together, Alexander's bare hands were as much a subject of fascination as the performance on stage, and the way he helped Cordelia with her cloak and offered his arm for support provided visible evidence that physical contact between them was not only possible but welcomed by both parties. Their behavior toward each other carried an intimacy that spoke of genuine partnership rather than mere social convenience, and even the most determined skeptics found it difficult to dismiss the authenticity of emotions that were so clearly displayed for anyone who cared to observe them. Alexander's charitable activities, which had previously been conducted in secret to avoid creating obligations or expectations, became public knowledge as his newfound openness extended to all aspects of his life. The revelation that he had been quietly funding hospitals, orphanages, and schools throughout London for years, contributing sums that dwarfed the donations of men who made great public displays of their philanthropy, forced society to reconsider their assumptions about his character and motivations. The transformation in Alexander's behavior extended beyond his willingness to appear in public without gloves to encompass a fundamental change in how he interacted with the world around him. Where he had once maintained careful distance from others and limited his conversations to the minimum required by courtesy, he now engaged with genuine interest and warmth that drew people to him in ways that his wealth and title alone had never achieved. Children, in particular, seemed to sense the change in him and responded with the uncomplicated affection that only the very young can offer, gathering around him whenever he appeared at charitable events or public functions with the confidence that their approach would be welcomed rather than rebuffed. The sight of the formerly untouchable Duke of Ravenshollow, surrounded by laughing children who climbed onto his lap and grasped his hands without fear, became one of London's most remarked-upon spectacles, providing visible proof that whatever curse or contamination society had attributed to him had been nothing more than elaborate fiction. His conversations with Cordelia in public settings revealed an intellectual partnership that complemented their obvious emotional connection, as they discussed everything from literature to politics to social reform with the ease of two minds that had found perfect compatibility. Their shared commitment to charitable work created opportunities for them to appear together at functions where their presence served causes larger than their own romance, allowing society to observe how naturally they worked as a team when focused on helping others rather than merely entertaining themselves. Queen Charlotte's initial reaction to the dramatic developments in her daughter's romantic life was a complex mixture of satisfaction at the success of her matchmaking scheme and concern about the unconventional nature of a union that defied so many of society's expectations about appropriate partnerships between members of the royal family and the nobility. The Queen had observed Alexander's transformation with the sharp eyes of someone who understood that such fundamental changes in character were rare and precious things that should not be taken lightly. But she also recognized that Cordelia's obvious happiness represented the fulfillment of hopes that had seemed increasingly unlikely as the years passed without any suitable suitor appearing to claim her daughter's hand. The private interview that the Queen requested with Alexander 10 days after his formal declaration of courtship was conducted in her personal study, away from the ceremonial chambers where official business was typically conducted, and the informal setting reflected her desire to understand the man behind the public transformation, rather than simply evaluate his suitability as a potential son-in-law. "Your Grace," she began after inviting him to take a seat in the comfortable chair positioned across from her desk, "I confess myself curious about the circumstances that have brought about such remarkable changes in your behavior and outlook. The man who sits before me today bears little resemblance to the cautious and distant figure who first agreed to escort my daughter to social functions." Alexander's response was delivered with the kind of openness that would have been impossible for him just weeks earlier, his willingness to share personal details reflecting the same courage that had allowed him to discard his gloves in pursuit of genuine human connection. "Your Majesty," he said, his hands resting comfortably on the arms of his chair rather than hidden from view. I have spent 16 years believing that I was fundamentally dangerous to those around me, that my very touch carried some form of contamination or curse that made normal relationships impossible. Princess Cordelia helped me understand that those beliefs were based on the traumatic misunderstandings of a frightened child rather than any objective reality, and in freeing me from those fears, she gave me back not only my hands, but my humanity. The Queen studied his face as he spoke, noting the sincerity in his expression and the absence of the rigid control that had previously characterized his every interaction with others. I have observed the change in Cordelia as well, she said thoughtfully. She has always been intelligent and capable, but she has never been truly happy until these recent weeks. You have given her something that all my efforts at matchmaking never could provide, the recognition that she is valued for her mind and heart rather than merely her position or her utility to others. The blessing that Queen Charlotte ultimately gave to their union was offered not as a political calculation or a strategic alliance, but as a mother's recognition that her daughter had found the kind of love that could not be manufactured through careful arrangement or social engineering. I must confess, she told Alexander with a smile that held both warmth and satisfaction, that when I first orchestrated your partnership, I hoped that proximity might kindle affection between you. But I never imagined that love would prove powerful enough to heal wounds as deep as those you both carried, or that my practical arrangement would blossom into the kind of devotion that poets celebrate in their verses. The Queen's announcement of their betrothal at the Christmas Eve ball held at Carlton House was crafted to present their engagement as a love match rather than a diplomatic alliance, emphasizing the romantic elements of their courtship, while acknowledging the practical benefits that would flow from their union. As Alexander and Cordelia stood together before the assembled representatives of London society, their hands joined and their faces radiant with happiness, even the most skeptical observers found themselves moved by the evidence of genuine affection that no amount of political maneuvering could have created. The evening concluded with their first public dance as an officially engaged couple, and as Alexander led Cordelia through the figures of the waltz with his bare hands holding hers for all to see, the symbolism was lost on no one present. The untouchable Duke had found healing through love, and the forgotten princess had discovered that she was worthy of passionate devotion, proving that even in the calculating world of high society, authentic emotion could triumph over fear and convention when two hearts were brave enough to risk everything for the possibility of genuine happiness together. The wedding of Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, and Her Royal Highness Princess Cordelia took place on a crisp February morning in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, with all of London society in attendance to witness what had become the most anticipated romantic union in a generation. The ceremony itself was conducted with the full pageantry that befitted the marriage of a royal princess, but every detail had been carefully chosen to reflect the deeply personal nature of the commitment being made between two people who had found in each other not only love, but the courage to abandon the protective barriers that had defined their separate existences for so many years. Cordelia entered the chapel wearing her grandmother's pearl-encrusted tiara and a gown of ivory silk that had been created by London's most celebrated dressmaker, but her radiant smile and the warmth in her grey eyes spoke of a happiness that no amount of finery could have created or enhanced. Alexander waited for her at the altar, dressed in his dress uniform as a colonel in the Guards, his hands conspicuously bare as he turned to watch her approach down the aisle that was lined with white roses and trailing ivy. The sight of his uncovered fingers, steady and ungloved as he prepared to accept the ring that would bind him to her in marriage, created a visible stir among the assembled guests, who remembered all too clearly the mysterious gloves that had once defined his public persona and the tragic mythology that had surrounded his refusal to allow human touch. When the Archbishop of Canterbury reached the portion of the ceremony that required the exchange of rings, Alexander's hands remained perfectly steady as he slipped the delicate band of gold and diamonds onto Cordelia's finger, his touch gentle but confident as he spoke the ancient words that transformed them from individual souls into a united partnership. The symbolism was lost on no one present, least of all on Queen Charlotte, who watched from the front pew with tears of joy streaming down her face as she observed the completion of a transformation that had begun with her strategic matchmaking scheme but had evolved into something far more profound and healing than she had ever dared to hope possible. The wedding breakfast that followed the ceremony was held in the state dining room at St. James's Palace, with the guest list carefully curated to include not only members of the nobility and diplomatic community, but also representatives from the various charitable organizations that had benefited from both Alexander's secret generosity and Cordelia's tireless advocacy on behalf of London's most vulnerable residents. The seating arrangements reflected the couple's determination to use their wedding celebration as an opportunity to bridge the social divides that typically separated the aristocracy from those who devoted their lives to public service, creating conversations and connections that would have been impossible under more conventional circumstances. Alexander moved through the reception with his hands bare and freely extended, offering firm handshakes and warm greetings to guests who had previously been denied any physical contact with him whatsoever, his obvious comfort with such interactions serving as a powerful demonstration of how completely he had overcome the fears that had once governed every aspect of his social behavior. Lord Pemberton, who had been among the first to experience Alexander's transformation at White's Club, remarked to several other guests that shaking hands with the Duke was now one of life's genuine pleasures, as his grip conveyed both strength and warmth in equal measure, making everyone who encountered him feel welcomed and valued rather than merely tolerated. The highlight of the reception was the couple's first dance as husband and wife, performed to a waltz that had been specially commissioned for the occasion and played by the palace's finest musicians. As Alexander led Cordelia onto the dance floor with his ungloved hands holding hers in full view of the assembled company, the symbolism of the moment resonated through the room like a bell, tolling the end of one era and the beginning of another. The waltz itself was a masterpiece of grace and partnership, with Alexander's bare hands guiding Cordelia through the intricate figures with a confidence that spoke of countless hours of practice and a deep trust in each other's ability to move as a single entity, rather than two separate individuals attempting to coordinate their actions. Every touch between them was visible to their guests, every gentle pressure of his fingers against her waist or her hand resting on his shoulder serving as evidence that physical contact between them was not only possible, but a source of joy and connection that enhanced rather than diminished their individual natures. Cordelia's face glowed with happiness as they moved together, her smile brilliant enough to outshine the magnificent chandeliers that illuminated the ballroom, while Alexander's expression conveyed a peace and contentment that none of the assembled guests had ever witnessed in him before. The applause that greeted the conclusion of their dance was sustained and heartfelt, acknowledging not merely the technical skill of their performance, but the emotional journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect unity and mutual trust. Queen Charlotte, who had rarely been seen to display emotion in public settings, was observed wiping tears from her eyes as she watched her daughter and new son-in-law take their bows, her satisfaction evident not only in their obvious happiness, but in her own role in bringing about a union that had healed wounds she had feared might never be overcome. The evening concluded with Alexander and Cordelia standing together to receive the congratulations of their guests, his armed thumbs around her waist and her hand resting comfortably on his chest, their public display of affection serving as a final, definitive statement that the barriers which had once kept them apart had been permanently and completely dismantled. 6 months after their wedding, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshollow had established themselves as one of London society's most influential and respected couples, their joint charitable endeavours and obviously affectionate marriage serving as an example that challenged many of the cynical assumptions about aristocratic relationships and the motivations that typically drove unions between members of their elevated social class. Their home in Grosvenor Square had become a gathering place for reformers, philanthropists, and intellectuals who were drawn by the couple's genuine commitment to improving conditions for London's less fortunate residents and their willingness to use their wealth and influence in service of causes larger than their own comfort and status. Alexander's transformation from a man who feared human contact to someone who was known throughout London for his warm handshakes and generous embraces had become legendary, inspiring others who struggled with their own fears and limitations to seek the help and understanding that might free them from self-imposed prisons of isolation and despair. His business meetings, which had once been conducted with rigid formality and careful distance, now included the kind of personal touches that turned professional relationships into genuine friendships. As he discovered that his willingness to connect with others on a human level actually enhanced rather than complicated his commercial success. Cordelia had found her voice as a social reformer in ways that her years of quiet, charitable work had never allowed, her royal status and obvious intelligence combining to make her a formidable advocate for legislative changes that would improve conditions in factories, workhouses, and schools throughout the realm. Her speeches before parliamentary committees and charitable organizations were delivered with passion and authority that commanded attention and respect from audiences who had previously dismissed women's contributions to public discourse as emotional rather than rational. The announcement that the Duchess was expecting their first child had been greeted with celebration throughout London society and genuine joy from the charitable organizations that had benefited from her tireless advocacy, as everyone recognized that the addition of a new generation to the Ravenshollow family would likely result in continued support for the causes that had become so central to the couple's shared mission. Alexander's reaction to the prospect of fatherhood had been a mixture of excitement and mock terror as he contemplated the practical challenges that lay ahead, particularly his complete inexperience with the intimate physical care that infants required from their parents. "Your Grace," Cordelia had teased him when he expressed concerns about his ability to manage such delicate tasks as changing nappies and bathing their child. Surely a man who rescued children from burning buildings should not be intimidated by the prospect of caring for one small baby. "I suppose I shall simply have to learn to be gentle with these hands that have spent so many years hidden from the world," Alexander had replied, with the self-deprecating humor that had become one of his most endearing characteristics since abandoning the rigid control that had once governed his every interaction with others. "At least I will not have to worry about my gloves getting in the way when precision and dexterity are required." The jest had become something of a running theme between them as they prepared for parenthood, with Alexander frequently expressing amazement at how many parental duties seemed to require the kind of direct physical contact that would have been impossible during his years of self-imposed isolation from human touch. The irony was not lost on either of them that their child would be born into a world where their father's hands were a source of comfort and security rather than fear and contamination, representing a complete reversal of the legacy that Alexander had expected to leave when he believed himself cursed and dangerous. The final scene of their remarkable journey together took place on a warm spring morning in the schoolroom of the new educational facility they had established for the children of London's working poor, a bright and airy space that had been designed to provide the kind of learning environment that most of these youngsters had never experienced in their brief and often difficult lives. Alexander sat at one of the small wooden desks with his sleeves rolled up and his hands completely bare as he helped a group of 6-year-olds practice their letters, his patience and gentleness with the children serving as powerful evidence of how completely he had overcome the fears that had once made such interactions impossible. His fingers guided small hands holding pencils, corrected the grip of children who had never held writing instruments before, and offered encouraging pats on shoulders and heads as young scholars struggled to master the basics of literacy that would open doors to futures their parents had never imagined possible there. Cordelia moved between the various groups of students with her notebook in hand, documenting their progress and identifying those who would benefit from additional resources or specialized instruction, her obvious pregnancy adding a glow to her features that made her more beautiful than she had ever been during her years as the invisible princess who believed herself unworthy of love and attention. The sight of them working together in perfect harmony, their shared commitment to education and social reform, creating a partnership that transcended the romantic love that had brought them together, represented the complete fulfillment of the hopes that Queen Charlotte had nurtured when she first arranged their practical partnership so many months earlier. When one of the youngest children stumbled and scraped his knee on the rough wooden floor, Alexander's response was immediate and instinctive, scooping the crying boy into his arms and holding him close, while Cordelia cleaned and bandaged the minor wound with supplies from the medical kit they kept in every classroom. The child's tears disappeared as quickly as they had come, replaced by the kind of trusting contentment that only comes from being held by someone whose touch conveys absolute safety and unconditional care. As the boy settled against Alexander's shoulder, with complete confidence that he was protected and valued, Cordelia smiled at her husband with eyes full of love and pride, knowing that their journey from isolation to connection, from fear to courage, from protection to vulnerability, had led them to exactly where they belonged, surrounded by children whose futures were brighter because 2 wounded souls had found the strength to remove their barriers and reach for each other with hands that healed rather than harmed.